that for me is the most interesting question about how we negotiate the position where getting the human out of the loop is the best answer to the next stage of AI deployment.
Thoughts?
Yeah, that's a journey the regulators are going to have to go on, I think.
Hello, I'm Pippa Tasker, one of the partners in the financial services team in London here at CMS. And I'm joined today by Rob Dedman, one of the other partners in the financial services team, but he's in the supervision, investigation and enforcement part of the team, far more interesting. And also joined by Charles Kerrigan, who's a partner in our crypto and digital assets team, but who specialises in emerging technologies. And we're here today to talk to you about AI in financial services, because I don't think I can say I've had a single conversation this year that hasn't touched on it in some capacity or other with all of my clients. And that's whether they are traditional financial institutions, so insurers or multinational asset managers who are more considered, shall we say, in their approach to these things, or the new entrants who are, of course, embracing it wholeheartedly. And I have to say that the conversations have very much been what and how they should be adopting it rather than if they should be adopting AI and similar technologies. I'm seeing you nodding, Charlie, so I take it you've had similar conversations. And to be perfectly frank, for my part, I think that's the right approach. I don't know how anybody in our industry could actually discharge their regulatory obligations without embracing the newer technologies, particularly if they're in the retail space. So it's the perfect way to help discharge your consumer duty obligations. But that's my view. Rob, perhaps also wearing your hat as the former head of enforcement at the PRA. Do you agree, or is it there be dragons avoided at all costs?
No, I don't think there are dragons, actually. I mean, we're going to come on to talk a little bit about some of the risks inherent in deploying AI and how to manage those risks. And Charlie, I know you've been doing a lot of work on that with your clients. But the reality of it is that the regulators, particularly the UK regulators, are very taken with the idea that AI is a tool which can produce really good results. And as a result, they're not against it in any way, shape or form. I think what you could say is that they're against poorly designed, poorly deployed and badly controlled AI, but I'm not sure that's any different actually to the way that they think about any other system that firms operate. So I think they're fully open, the doors are open to it, and I think firms should step through it. I don't know, Charlie, obviously you've been talking to your clients about that.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about AI is it makes everything quicker, whatever else it does. And you have the traditional triangle that everyone talks about in business of quicker, cheaper, and better. And I think in AI, you're definitely getting quicker and cheaper. So we're focused on the question of, are you getting better? And of course, the AI becomes more capable. The more you're using it inside a financial firm and inside a regulator, the more opportunity it has to learn from the data it should be learning from. So if it's learning from the information you've got inside the organization rather than things that are on Reddit, then that is going to make it better at the job. So there's also a super interesting question about shadow IT. All of us are speaking to clients about shadow IT. And if we're in a room saying, which organizations don't allow IT to be used, if everyone puts their hands up, and of course we say, well, people are therefore asking ChatGPT on their phones. So you need to engage with it. I think this is Rob's points that it's necessary to engage. But of course, all the customers have got shadow IT, because all of the surveys that the clients are playing back to us and the regulators saying anybody wanting financial advice is asking Chat or Claude. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think you definitely need processes to deal with that. And if for no other reason, then it's not infallible. So, and you don't know what they are using on their phone. So, but having said that, taking half a step back, as you say, a lot of our clients are saying if they may prevent their staff from using AI because they're still wrapping their heads around it. I think that's actually been a big topic of conversation recently as well, is people go, right, we've got to do this, but how? It's it's quite overwhelming. I think you've seen more examples than most. Have you got any sort of practical tips about how people could go about introducing it to their organizations?
Everybody's still working it out. And the challenge is, by definition, the difference between AI and traditional software is it doesn't stay the same. So it's different in so many ways. It's self-learning, so it's different in the afternoon to what it is in the morning. The models are constantly updated, so what is being, the infrastructure is changing. And then, of course, the data that it's fed with is constantly changing. So that, I think, is the very hard challenge for regulators and firms, that traditionally, if you know what the software does and you know what the inputs are, then you know what the outputs are. Here it's fuzzy, but I think that is consistent with the outcomes focused regulation. It's one of the advantages that the UK has got as infrastructure. I guess, Rob, when you're looking at this with your current and your former hats, how do you approach it? What are the kind of questions that you're asking to firms to be able to make an assessment of whether they're doing things the right way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I mean, it obviously starts with governance. I mean, as everything does in the firms that we work with, and one of the questions that a lot of firms are grappling with is this question: well, should we have bespoke governance that just deals with AI? Should we fold it into the governance that we currently have? How do we make the top of the shop? So the people at the board level, and non-executives in particular, how do we get them sufficiently engaged with AI and sufficiently expert in it that they can challenge the executive on the deployment of AI? And so that whole governance piece, I think, is the sort of really starting point for this whole discussion. There then is a bit about how do you create it, deploy it, control it. But if you don't get the governance right, top down and bottom up, so that they meet in a sort of really sort of interlocking way, I think you sort of set off in the wrong direction at that point, because what you then have is back to your point about people just using ChatGPT outside or something like that. You don't have a sort of centralised view as to how this stuff should be used and how it should be governed. You end up in a situation where people just go off and use it as they see fit, and that's where the risk is, and that's where the regulators see the risk is as well. So that whole piece about governance, I think, is really important. And there's lots of different ways of skinning that cat. I know you've been working with some clients on that governance process.
Well, you guys are the expert, because governance is not about having a policy, because, as you two know, people get policies and put them in a drawer. And I think one of the things that generative AI has done is meant that there is zero cost to having impeccable policies for everything that touches your world. Everybody could have AML and all the supporting policies. You can have AI governance policies of every description and all the materials to back them up, because there is now almost zero cost of producing written materials. So the operationalization piece, which has been the obsession in your world for years, as the regulators are saying, anyone can have a policy, do you understand how to make that a practical reality, is we're just back around with AI as a different version of this. How do you turn a governance policy into something that's operating? And maybe the complication, I have to throw this back to you two, is if it's a policy relating to something like financial crime, that you have a head of financial crime and they have ownership of it. You have a policy relating to product, there's a head of product and they have ownership of it. AI is just smudged everywhere. It gets into everything. It's like water. And the challenge as we put these things in place, as you say, trying to help people figure it out, is there isn't a single point of ownership, and you have a mix of people who are enthusiastically trying to own it so they can go faster, versus people who are only facing the downside of these things. If you're a risk and compliance person, you got more downside than upside. So there are competing stakeholders, and I think the first thing that we start with is, as an organization, how do you do this naturally? How do you not force this into a different way of operating, to say we've got to operationalize these policies? It's right across the organization, it's every level, it's every business line, it's every back office and middle office. how do we turn that into something that can operate? So that, I guess, is a hard question, because that's what you guys are having to sort of talk to regulators.
Yeah, and a lot of that is culture, to your point, that what we're looking at today, we'll be looking at something quite different in a couple of months, years' time. So you have to have everybody in the organisation looking at it in the same way. And as you were saying, you don't need to completely reinvent the framework, but you've got to have that framework right, not just a policy in a drawer.
We get asked about ethical use of AI a lot, and I think is one of the most interesting questions, but it's the one where we're almost most impotent, because we would always say, and the folks that I work closely with who are doing this, your culture determines how you answer questions about ethics related to AI or anything else. And you see this in banking over the decades. You can tell people not to do something, but if there's an incentive for them to do it, then you can be sure they'll find a way of doing it. So handing off questions that appear to have an ethical dimension to an ethical decision-making group, it doesn't work, because the gravity of the organization's culture will tell you the answer, regardless of what the group is surfacing as a way of approaching it. And certainly you can't say to people in a vacuum, we have this moral dilemma, how do we resolve it? Because you can't resolve moral dilemmas in a vacuum, and humans have conflicts of interest. They feel them inside. They're not something that you can just deal with intellectually.
It's also a really odd place to get to for an organisation to say, we have this set of ethics with our main business, but when it comes to AI, our ethical subset is a bit different to the ethics that we have as a business. It's a really odd position to get to, I think, particularly in the financial services space, where, as Pippa says, this idea of organisational culture pervading top-down, bottom-up, is really important from the regulator's perspective in terms of how they view the danger that firms pose to consumers, or the danger that firms pose to the system. They draw a direct line between organisational culture and risk in that context, and they're right to do it, because we've seen time and again the situations where organisational culture has translated into crystallised risk. It happens all over the place, every day of the week in different organisations. So the idea that you would have a sort of different organisational culture for this bit of what you're doing just seems a recipe for a bit of chaos, to my mind. It just doesn't feel like the right outcome in that context.
In the enforcement, are you like a detective? Are you having to pull the thread and say, this is how I think the organisation operates, even if it says it operates in a different way, and working back from that? Right.
Yeah, and the difference between how organisations say they operate and how they actually operate is quite often where the enforcement cases are to be found, actually. So it's to your point about having great policies but not living by what you say you're going to do. That into that space between those two things is exactly where an enforcer and a regulator inserts themselves when they want to take an enforcement case.
As opposed to the really good houses who are doing everything right, but they haven't written it down. So the regulator comes in and goes, prove it. And you go, I promise we really can. But actually coming back to that and enforcement, I'm going to ask the very obvious question that if something goes wrong, and I mean, we've all heard about hallucinations, I'm going to kick our profession rather than our clients. There's been headlines with people relying on AI and there's been hallucinations. AI did it, not me, is never going to be an excuse, right?
No, it's not. And the reality is actually that's no different to any other system that you deploy in an organisation. The idea that you would say, well, the garbage that comes out of this system, I've relied on that, so that's fine. And the garbage that comes out of an AI, if you don't prompt it correctly or you use it incorrectly, there's no difference between those two things. Really, it's the sophistication of the system and how the system operates, and understanding how the system operates, that becomes quite important in that context. So the sort of black box on the side of the desk argument that you see the regulators using all the time is part of that. But absolutely, a sort of ignorance of the system is no excuse in that context, and you can see regulators already starting to think about that. It puts them in a slightly an odd position, though, as a regulator, because at the same time as you want to encourage its use, you also want to say to people, but there's some teeth behind it, don't muck it up. And so there's a real kind of tension in that, particularly with regulators in the UK at the moment who are under this massive political pressure to try and enhance the UK's financial standing in that context. So they find themselves in real tension. I think the answer to that as an enforcer is, whenever you adopt a new system or a new process across an industry, there will be easy outlying low-hanging fruit cases where somebody has, for example, gone off and used grok to produce a piece of material, and it's gone completely mad. And as a result, if you're the regulator, you want to establish the principle that this stuff has to work. You take the easy low-hanging fruit cases to start with to establish that principle. And I suspect we're going to see quite a few easy low-hanging fruit cases, judging by some of the conversations that I know we're having with people. So I think it's there. But it's also, the regulators are not going to just go randomly enforcing all the time, because obviously they've got this idea of promoting growth too.
Yeah, but then can I ask you, Charlie, about how, again, going back to the implementation of these things, because where I see that some of that low-hanging fruit being organisations also not knowing that somebody has embedded something in a spreadsheet somewhere that is spewing out data that's incorrect, and nobody's actually realised that that's happened. Are you seeing quite a lot of implementation, as you were saying, people doing it on their phones, but how has it been working?
I love hallucinations. It's one of my favourite things about AI, partly because they can be so funny, although in the context that we're talking about here, as you say, we're speaking at a time when law firms are having some public embarrassment, and I feel for people. This is bound to happen. Lawyers are working in a time-pressured environment, and the systems produce what looks like very, very strong text. So that is not a difficult problem for lawyers to solve in the analog way. We're supposed to be good at sourcing information, fact-checking, those kind of things. So that's just adding a bit of time and having the organizational culture that people don't feel that if they need more time in order to check something's right, that they don't have that time to check. They're either under the pressure of a deadline or the pressure of a budget. So there are some relatively easy things there. But from a technical perspective, LLMs hallucinating helps you understand how they work. And all of the models have different characteristics. They're better and worse at others. There are specialist proprietary models that can generate text but aren't large language models and therefore wouldn't have the same hallucination problem. We spend a lot of time with people benchmarking models and working with the model providers of all sorts, large and small ones, where you have, as Rob describes, the black box, and the two main parts of the black box. One is the data that goes into it, and the second is the although that shouldn't be a black box, you should be able to trace data. So data lifecycle is a big issue, and if people aren't on top of that, then it's something that they can relatively easily put systems in place for. But then, what's inside the model? If you aren't operating the model yourself, you're using a software provider that itself is embedding models, you can see noticeably different performance day by day, and then send questions up the chain saying, did you change the model? Like, what's happening? And often the answer is, yeah, we switched from Claude to Chat or something like that, or the default model has changed or something of that type. And that can be for a whole range of reasons. It can be performance reasons. It can be economic reasons. It can be reasons related to things that are happening in the relationship, the outsourcing relationship. So again, we're referencing things that are all sitting squarely on your desks. How does outsourcing in regulated firms work? And this is where we spend all the time putting our heads together to say, what do you need to surface now that's different? And I think whilst relying on indemnities and representations and things like that is the conventional way for lawyers, and it does work. I'm not suggesting that is akin to Rob's description of you just let the system get on with it, say it wasn't me, it was AI, sir. But there is now, I think, an increasing importance in having the technical subject matter expertise. So you're not simply relying on, well, I got an indemnity from the upstream provider, or I was under the EU AI Act terms, I'm just a deployer, not a provider, so it's not on me. I think the responsibility is incumbent on everyone who's using AI, which pulls us back to this question around how you're setting governance policies and continually updating them. As the systems get more capable, you may need less oversight, but you would need to be testing and checking and being able to justify it. I think the EU AI Act is interesting because it's controversial and it's expensive to comply with all the requirements. But in the heart, I think it's just saying three things. One is identify the AI systems that you're using. 2, run a risk classification in relation to them. 3, keep records. Well, that's pretty basic governance requirements. There's a lot more paperwork sitting behind that, but that's a pretty good starting point for how you should be thinking about using AI. If you don't even have a list of the AI that's operating inside your organisation, then you definitely have some work to do.
Absolutely. And I get then the next piece is a certain amount of education to your point, so that people can actually audit it. And that's at the lower levels for the people who are using it, as well as your board and people who are reviewing.
Yeah. And there's an interesting question about indemnities and those sorts of things, because if you think about outcomes-based regulation, an indemnity it helps you commercially in that context, but it doesn't help you fix the bad outcome for the consumer that was produced by the person misusing the system. And that's, for me, the sort of interesting part of all of this, is that if you move into an outcomes-based world, as the consumer duty is, there is massive power in those in AIs to help improve consumer outcomes. And it's a real power for good. There's all these narratives. There've always been these narratives around AI is going to take over the world and everything's going to blow up and everything's going to be terrible. And the reality of it is actually these are incredibly powerful tools that can help produce really good outcomes for firms in a way, to your point, Charlie, that manages cost and makes things quicker as well. So there's a sort of virtuous circle about all of that. And the outcomes-based processes help that, I think. But what it also means is that you've just got to keep an eye on what is coming out the back end in terms of the real impact on your customers, and make sure that you course correct in real time if you see that something is going awry. And as long as you're doing that, coupled with some good governance and some risk assessment on the way in, as you were saying, that sort of gives you your end-to-end, doesn't it, in that context, I think?
What's the view of the regulators now around personalisation, particularly facing retail? Because I guess one of the superpowers of AI is that it can crunch all the individual information, and we're seeing that the most reported aspect of Revolut's news about, I've got a more technical aspect that we'll come to, but we'll start with the reported bit, which is it's the customer behavioural data and engine that is going to drive good outcomes for customers. How do regulators think about personalisation these days?
I was going to say it depends, to give a perfectly wonderful lawyer's answer. As in insurance, it can be a negative, because the more you know about somebody, it can mean that their premiums go up. Similarly in the credit world. But that said, when you're focusing on good outcomes for other products, the more you know about somebody, the more you can say, look, this really isn't right for you. It's correct for 90% of the population, but not the rest. And also bringing in the new targeted support, the idea that you can go, people like you. There's that fine balance between how much information you have and how personalised it is. Is it full financial advice? But as you say, much more powerful. They should be much better recommendations, which would mean more people get access to the help that they need, which is ultimately what the regulators are driving at.
And that's why the wealth management space is a prime example of a space where this tool could really change the way things work. Because if you think about wealth managers, they're obviously dealing with real people at the end of that process. They need as much information as they can get about those people to make sure that the recommendations or the support they give them is the right support. So that's a really helpful part of it. And they're on really thin margins as well, financially. So in that context, we talked about that virtuous circle, right in the middle of the wealth management space, you can see that virtuous circle existing right there.
Yeah.
The issue then that you have, of course, is that the regulators, but you're dealing with real people and real people's lives, and we need to. It brings us back into this whole conversation about how do you control, and do you need specific rules about that? And the AI Act, I think, is really interesting because it is a piece of AI-specific legislation. When you look into the UK financial sector, the regulators are pretty clear. I mean, subject to anything that Sheldon Mills is going to say when he comes out with his review. The reality is we think that the regulatory system in the UK is flexible enough to encompass AI without needing AI-specific rules. there's probably a case for the regulators providing a sort of bit more guidance around how AI should be used, and maybe some good and bad practice examples. And I think the FCA came out a few days ago with a suggestion of that they might well start doing that, thinking about good and bad practice. And I think that would be really helpful for the industry in sort of just helping sort of steer them in the right direction. But in terms of a sort of UK Financial Services AI Act type scenario, I'm not sure you necessarily need it based on the regulatory system as it sits currently.
It's one of the things that I think we all say, that facing financial institutions, we all join this conversation at slightly different points. But I think it's easy to say to financial firms, you should be good users of AI because you understand the core at the heart of most AI regulation, certainly the European regulation, which is classic European customer-focused innovation, balancing innovation and customer harm, comes from the paraphrase, don't screw the customer, which in the terms of the Act is don't manipulate people to act against their interests. And when we, going back a few years now, in the groups where we were looking at what the core of those obligations in the Act would be, it's interesting to dig into what we mean by manipulate, because we were getting these texts put forward and various groups responding in the rooms and saying, well, isn't that advertising? Doesn't that manipulate people? And of course, that's not what the policymakers are trying to get at. But it demonstrates how broad these issues are. But if we pull it back to finance, financial firms have always understood how to provide evidence-based justifications for the products that they're putting in front of customers and the suitability tests. So all of the stuff that financial firms have learnt over the past however many decades puts them in a position to be about the best safe operators of AI systems of any industry going around.
Yeah, and to my mind, it's fairness, and going back again to that culture. It's, I mean, when you said how does it differ in personalisation, all of those things, whether you're trying to do better or avoid harm, it's treat your customers fairly, act in their best interests, which sometimes gets in the way of profits. But in this case, I think the two are likely to align.
Yeah, and it's a good example, isn't it? That's where the consumer duty bites. So if you manipulate your customers into doing something that's not in their interests, you haven't promoted customer understanding, because if they understood what you were doing, they wouldn't do it. And you haven't achieved a good customer outcome. Well, there's the consumer duty right there telling you that those are the outcomes you need to achieve. So it's back to this point about the AI Act and the way that's thought about. Actually, the UK system already has these concepts baked into it from the financial services sector, which serve actually really quite well in that context, I think.
And that starts to become, the more it gets rolled out, the more you can see the specifics of those questions. So as we're now discussing with different clients and stakeholders, that's the how do you draw the line? And it's a fuzzy line between what used to be called robo-advice and providing people with sufficient information and perhaps some coaching and context without making the decision for them in relation to a product. That certainly, if you don't have the right license to be able to make those recommendations.
And again, ensuring that the people receiving that information understand the difference and they don't think that you are providing recommendations. That will be one of the challenges, I think. But my main takeaway from everything we've said is, although it's all very new, we've got the framework in place, or all of our financial institution clients should do to be able to take it forward. Do either of you have any final thoughts or tips or tricks you would like to?
Well, I'm going to pick up on that point and go off piste, because the question I find most interesting at the moment is, as we're helping people build governance systems, the AI Act has this human in the loop requirement to it, and it's obvious why that would be necessary as we look at understanding the technical reasons behind hallucinations and the rest of it, and just having oversight. We're now in a position where some of the AI systems are so grounded in their sources. They're not hallucinating. That's a technical problem that is to a large extent being solved by engineers, leaving aside the point that's always raised about the sort of fundamental statistical nature of LLMs, but you don't have to use LLMs, you can do source grounding and so on. So what if the human in the loop, people are slow and they mess things up? So that for me is the most interesting question about how we negotiate the position where getting the human out of the loop is the best answer to the next stage of AI deployment.
Thoughts?
Yeah, that's a journey the regulators are going to have to go on, I think. So, I mean, there needs to be a conversation around all of this stuff, and the regulators, and we know this because we do talk to the regulators from time to time on these sorts of issues. They're very open to having dialogue with industry and looking at the bleeding edge of all of this, just to make sure that they understand the direction of travel. Partly because it's changing so quickly that anything that they do risks being out of date almost before it's done, particularly when they're talking about formulating policy, which can take months and months and months to formulate policy inside a regulator. So they're very seized of the idea of making sure that they're really up to date with what's going on. I think there's probably, as I said, a bit of a journey for them to go on in terms of getting humans completely out of the loop in that context. But look, I mean, it's coming. It's definitely coming, and at some point they are going to have to grapple with it.
And it may not be well known, but in the UK regulators, financial regulators, where you used to work, and Pippa and I deal with all the time, they're full of data scientists. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bleeding edge people. And would you say, can we put words in your mouth? How do you find out what a regulator thinks? Ask them. Is that a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And those dialogue opportunities that are there in sort of macro policy terms are really important. So for the industry, and I know the industry is already doing this and not telling anyone anything they don't already know, but the industry really does need to engage with the regulator on the good and the bad of these sorts of things, because regulatory policy is best made when it's informed by the real world experience of the people who are going to be subject to the rules when they implement them. And so the more dialogue there is in that space, the better in that context, I think.
And on that note, if you'd like to continue the conversation with any one of us, or like some tips on how to have a dialogue with the regulator about your deployment of AI, please feel free to reach out to any one of us or your usual CMS contact who'll be able to put you in touch with the right person. Because as you've seen, we've got experts from all across the industry who will be able to help you.